If you like watching documentaries, you may have come across one about Yoon Seong-yeo, a 53-year-old Korean who was wrongfully accused of killing a middle school girl and has recently cleared his name. He had been convicted as the killer in the eighth of a string of cases surrounding the so-called Hwaseong murders. A model prisoner during the years he served, Yoon was released on parole in 2009. Even after his release, Yoon still had no way to prove his innocence. Then, a dramatic turn of events came in 2019 when the real criminal of the Hwaseong murders was identified by a DNA test. Chun-jae, who was already serving a prison sentence for the killing of his sister-in-law in 1994, finally confessed to all of his 10 murders in Hwaseong, including the one that had incarcerated Yoon. In a retrial, Yoon was found not guilty, and the judge apologized for the wrongful conviction that was made 30 years ago. The retrial also found that Yoon had been forced to confess guilt. The police used sleep deprivation and other forms of torture. It is believed that Yoon can now claim financial compensation for his wrongful conviction and time in prison, but he expressed that no amount of money will be enough to replace the years he lost. Many Koreans hope that he will manage to live out the rest of his life in whatever way that could make up for the hard times he had to endure. Right, and when we say that he served 20 years in prison, that means how many actual years he was in prison. So it's different from being sentenced to 20 years in prison. His sentence was life imprisonment, but he served only 20 years. And he was wrongfully convicted for the eighth killing, which means that he was convicted as the killer, but he was wrongfully convicted so. So that means he was not actually the killer, but he was convicted as such, and that was wrong. Now, when we say the eighth killing in the Hwaseong murders, we are implying that the Hwaseong murders is a series of murders. So there were 10 murders, and this one was the eighth. So for the eighth killing in the Hwaseong murders. And then he was found not guilty. So when you are found something in a court, that means the judge decides one way or another. So the judge in this case decided that he was not guilty or innocent in the recent retrial. We can also say, after having served 20 years in prison as the wrongfully convicted killer in the eighth of the Hwaseong murders, Yoon Seong-yeo's innocence has finally been proven in a recent retrial. So again, he served 20 years in prison, and why did he do so? Because he was wrongfully convicted as the killer. So he was the wrongfully convicted killer. Doesn't mean he was an actual killer. He was just convicted as such. His innocence, or the fact that he was not guilty, has finally been proven, which means it's done. The case is closed. The judge has found that he is innocent. We can also say, in a recent retrial following 20 years of incarceration, the wrongfully convicted Yoon Seong-yeo was acquitted for the murder committed by serial killer Chun-jae. So, 20 years of incarceration. Incarceration means that he was put in prison. That's how long he was in prison. So that is incarceration. If you are incarcerated, that means you are put in prison. And then he was acquitted, which means he was let go. It means he was found innocent or not guilty. So when you are acquitted for something, then that means all of the charges against you are released. Now, we said serial killer Chun-jae. When we say serial killer, it means that the person is not just a killer of one person, but the committer of a series of murders. So a serial killer is what Chun-jae was. Yes, so in this sentence, we're saying what he pled. So when you are taken to court and you are accused of something, you have to plead something, and that is either to be guilty or to be not guilty. In this case, he pleaded, or we can also say pled, not guilty. So he pled or pleaded that he was innocent. And on top of that, he said he was forced to confess by the police. So when you're forced to confess something, that means someone is making you say you did something wrong. So when we say confess in this case, we're not necessarily saying that you are telling the truth. You're forced to say that you committed the crime that you are accused of committing. And then when we say his voice was never heard, we're not talking in a literal sense. His voice may have been heard physically, but no one ever paid it any attention. No one listened to him. He was ignored. So his voice was never heard was one way that you can say that. Now you can also say he pleaded innocent and accused the police of forcing his confession, but his claims fell on deaf ears. So again, what did he plead? He pleaded innocent, which is not guilty, same thing. And on top of that, he accused the police, which means he said that the police forced his confession. They forced him to make a confession. But what happened after that? His claims, so his accusation, fell on deaf ears. When something falls on deaf ears, that means nobody's listening. Whatever you're saying is being ignored. So it doesn't, again, mean that the ears are deaf, meaning the ears cannot physically hear anything. It just means that the ears are not listening. So his claims fell on deaf ears. Lastly, we can say he denied guilt, alleging the police had forced his confession, but no one paid attention to him. So when you deny something, then obviously you're saying that you didn't do it. So he denied guilt, meaning he pleaded innocent. And he alleged that the police had forced his confession. When you allege something, you are making a claim, you're saying something. So he is alleging or saying that the police forced him to confess. But again, no one paid attention to him. Yes, and the key word in this sentence, I would say, is compensate. So when you compensate someone for something, that means you pay back something to them for something that they have lost. So what did he lose? He lost his life, time from his life. He had a difficult time. So the difficult time he had to spend in prison is what he lost. And what will compensate for that, or what will pay him back for all of that? The ability to live as happily as he can. So normally you wouldn't think someone who went through such difficult times could live happily. So that's why we say that the Koreans hope he will be able to live as happily as he can. So it means to whatever extent is possible. We can also say a lot of Koreans wish for his happiness to whatever degree that could make up for all of his lost years. So many Koreans hope that he could be happy to whatever degree. To whatever degree means however much is possible. However much is possible he can be happy, that would make up for all of his lost years. So make up for something. When you make up for something, you right the wrong. You correct what is incorrect. So to make up for what is incorrect, all of his lost years. He lost many years by being in prison. So those were years that otherwise he could have spent in a much happier way. Lastly, we can say, many in Korea want nothing more than to see him live out the rest of his years peacefully and without further hardship. So many people in Korea, when they want nothing more, that means we are saying that they want very much to see him live out the rest of his years. To live out the rest of your years, usually you would say this after a long term of living. So when you retire, you may want to live out the rest of your years in a certain way. So Koreans hope that he can live out the rest of his years peacefully and without further hardship. So what was the hardship? The hardship was all the time in prison. So suffering, hardship. Right, and you mentioned cold cases. Now what is a cold case? When we say cold case, we are talking about a criminal investigation which is not yet solved. So the cold part is the unsolved part of that. And when we say cases, well, we're not talking about just any case. When we talk about a cold case, we're talking about a criminal case. And of course, one that has not been solved. So we're saying that there are many cold cases in Korea, many cases that still have to be solved. But as seen in Lee Chun-jae's case, we can expect that justice will be served in the end. When justice is served, we are saying that the person who committed the crime pays a penalty. So once they pay a penalty, we can say that justice has been served. The wrong has been righted. We can also say there are still a lot of unsolved cases in Korea, but Lee Chun-jae's conviction could indicate that the others too will eventually be brought to justice. So again, an unsolved case, we're talking about the cold cases, unsolved criminal cases, but Lee Chun-jae's conviction could indicate something. So it could indicate, it could mean that something else. It could signal that something else. In this case, that something else is that other criminals, like Lee Chun-jae, which have not been found yet, will eventually be brought to justice. So this is another way of saying that justice is served to the criminal, or the criminal is brought to justice. So either way, there is justice. Lastly, we can say Korea still has other cases to be solved, but we should hope that through this example with Lee Chun-jae, those perpetrators will also come to light. When we say we should hope for something, that doesn't mean that it's a recommendation. It means we probably do. So we probably hope that when we look at this example with Lee Chun-jae, other perpetrators. So the perpetrator of a crime is the committer of that crime. So the criminal. Perpetrator is another word for criminal. Will also come to light. When something comes to light, that means right now it's in the darkness, right? It cannot be seen, so it's hidden. Those perpetrators right now are hiding in the darkness, but they will come to light eventually.